Welcome to this presentation. Thank you for your interest in my doctoral thesis. This dissertation centered on the integration of theory and lesson planning in teacher education. Let me start by sharing the personal motivations that led me to choose this topic. Some time ago, when I worked as an artistic swimming instructor, I would plan my training sessions. Initially to obtain professional certification, then for my own practice. Over time, my lesson plan templates evolved. When I started my doctoral studies, I became aware of the pressing need for research in the field of lesson planning. So I decided to focus on this aspect of teaching practice. I saw this as a chance to reflect on my own lesson planning routines and to deep dive into questions such as what kind of decisions do I make? How did my university studies shape this decision making? And more recently, what differentiates the way I used to plan my training sessions at the University Sports Center of Munich from the way I currently plan my online tutorials? Well, beyond sports education, in the context of formal education, lesson planning is part of teachers' everyday practice. The relevance of lesson planning is widely recognized in teacher education. Most research studies on lesson planning were conducted during the 70s through the 90s as part of the decision-making paradigm. As a consequence, there is a limited knowledge base for effective lesson planning preparation. Learning to plan lessons is typically associated with the opportunity to engage with an authentic aspect of teaching practice. Now, another potential opportunity is less well known. Some researchers argue that lesson planning may help to overcome an old educational problem, that of connecting theory with practice. Professional knowledge may be defined as conceptual knowledge stemming from research findings and theories and typically acquired in teacher preparation programs. Research shows that the acquisition of professional knowledge is not sufficient to become a competent teacher. Also necessary is the ability to connect this knowledge with perception, interpretation, and decision-making situations. Lesson planning may be an adequate context to develop this kind of abilities. To be clear, when planning lessons, pre-service teachers may deliberately consider how professional knowledge relates to concrete classroom teaching situations and translates into lesson planning decisions. As a result, they may recognize the relevance of professional knowledge for their own practice and be more willing to use it in the future. Then, as pre-service teachers engage in recurrent cycles of lesson planning, enactment, and reflection, the professional knowledge that was applied to successful lesson planning decisions is likely to transform into procedural knowledge. If lesson planning is to become a pedagogy that helps pre-service teachers transform professional knowledge into teaching practice, then professional knowledge must be connected with the lesson planning process in a deliberate and thoughtful manner. At present, however, there is little knowledge about how pre-service teachers may develop connections between professional knowledge and their own lesson planning decisions. This research gap was addressed in my doctoral thesis. Furthermore, lesson planning and observation of teaching are two interrelated aspects of practice. Teachers' observations of students' responses during instruction enable them to adjust their lesson plans to students' needs. Teachers' observations can also inform future lesson planning decisions. To date, teacher education research has paid little attention to the relationships between planning and observation, particularly with regard to the ability to use professional knowledge about principles of teaching and learning, which are part of teachers' preparation. There are arguments both in favor of and against a relationship between planning and observation. Based on the framework of professional vision, a similarity between planning and observation is that they require the application of professional knowledge related to principles of teaching and learning when reasoning about classroom teaching situations. Either when planning or observing, we can describe teachers' actions. For example, in this classroom discussion, the teacher is responding to students' contributions with questions such as this one. Moreover, we can predict the effects of the teacher's actions on students' learning. For example, this teacher question will support students' reasoning and understanding. Finally, it's possible to explain how teachers' actions relate to specific concepts. For example, research shows that this teacher question is a talk move that encourages students to listen to one another. On the other hand, a difference between planning and observation is that they require the application of professional knowledge to different situations. Planning involves envisioning or mentally simulating actions, whereas observation involves continuously processing external information. A greater understanding of their similarities and differences would be useful for developing curricula that support preservice teachers in connecting theory with practice. To be specific, does acquiring one ability ensure the acquisition of the other ability? This research gap was also addressed in my doctoral thesis. Two studies were conducted to bridge the identified research gaps. The first study counted with the special collaboration of Professor Rosella Santagata from the University of California, Irvine. This study investigated how to develop connections between professional knowledge and lesson planning, and which scaffolds may support this ability. An educational approach to lesson planning and a tool for its implementation in preparation programs were developed on the basis of research literature. The tool, referred to as the lab, was subsequently implemented in 2 consecutive cohorts of a teacher education program at 3 time points of their preparation. The lab was used for planning, enactment, and reflection as part of coursework assignments. The tool design was optimized through iterative revisions on the basis of field observations and the perceptions of preservice teachers, faculty members, and directors of the program. Specifically, prompt clarity and template usability were enhanced. In addition, these data were used to evaluate the lab implementation and to provide recommendations for future implementers. The second study involved the special collaboration of Professor James Hibbert from the University of Delaware. The first goal of this study was to examine the potential of the lab to detect connections between professional knowledge and lesson planning. Qualitative and quantitative content analyses were conducted with the labs completed by one of the cohorts mentioned earlier at the end of their first year of preparation. Up to that moment, pre-service teachers had received opportunities for planning and observation. The second goal of this study was to explore possible relationships between planning and observation. Participants' observation skills were assessed with a professional vision test and compared with their lesson plans. Now I'm going to focus on 4 main findings of the dissertation, and I will present them and discuss them. According to the educational approach to lesson planning, pre-service teachers may connect professional knowledge with their own lesson planning decisions by doing the following: planning lessons, writing lesson plans, and developing hypotheses. In every hypothesis, they need to select a relevant instructional aspect, predict its possible effects on student learning, and justify this prediction with references to principles of teaching and learning. After enactment, pre-service teachers need to reflect on their lesson plans by examining the fulfillment of their predictions on the basis of representative samples of students' responses. If the predictions were not fulfilled, they need to use both professional knowledge and information of the lesson context to explain why, suggest alternatives, and develop new hypotheses. Future implementers of the lab may need to adapt the tool to the local preparation context, for example, the wording of the lab tasks to specific curriculum requirements, take measures to ensure the acceptance and sustainable implementation of the lab among pre-service teachers and faculty, for example, by clarifying the educational relevance of hypothesis development in lesson planning, and support pre-service teachers' ability to develop hypotheses, for example, with the following scaffolded progression. Pre-service teachers may receive opportunities for the gradual application of professional knowledge to lesson planning activities that are gradually more authentic. They may first analyze lesson plans and hypotheses, second, plan their own lessons and develop hypotheses, and then engage in further cycles, starting with the analysis of lesson plans that have been previously enacted. This model suggests that the development and analysis of hypotheses may support the application of professional knowledge to lesson planning. Pre-service teachers might benefit from opportunities to develop and analyze hypotheses and to progress from analyzing lesson plans to lesson planning, enactment, and reflection. This finding expands previous research on the educational relevance of lesson planning to connect theory with practice and goes beyond previous models on lesson planning by proposing a lesson planning approach that supports the application of professional knowledge to both decision-making and the continuous improvement of lesson plans. Further research is needed to examine the impact of this approach on the quality of lesson planning decisions and student learning. Further research may also benefit from integrating subject-specific perspectives into this approach. Finding 2 is represented in the following table. The rows correspond to the 18 pre-service teachers of the sample. The 4 columns represent the 4 criteria used to assess participants' hypotheses on their lesson plans, or in other words, their predictions and justifications. The 3 columns represent the 3 rating levels employed to determine the degree of fulfillment for every criterion. Here we have the frequencies of the predictions and justifications in every participant. Regarding the ability to predict, the majority of the participants showed predictions about possible effects of instruction on student learning. However, less than the half of the participants used professional knowledge to justify their predictions, and less than a quarter of the participants cited research findings and theories to support their justifications. Let's have a look at an example representing high levels of lesson planning skills. This is the lesson plan of the participant with the strongest profile. In one of his hypotheses, he expected a problem-solving situation to activate students' thinking. He justified this prediction by explaining that students need to have an active role in their learning process, and cited literature that was addressed in his study program. These results suggest that the lab can detect the nature of connections between professional knowledge and lesson planning and their variation among pre-service teachers. As such, this tool may help teacher educators implement the proposed approach, as well as identify how their students make use of the theories addressed in their courses and which connections are in need of additional support. This finding expands previous research on the application of professional knowledge to lesson planning by showing how the construct of professional vision can be used for data collection and analysis. This research also demonstrates how professional vision can be applied to a broader range of professional situations, responding to Nichols' call for research. This finding also expands previous research on the development of lesson plan templates and other pedagogical tools by providing a template that encourages the application of principles of teaching and learning to lesson planning. Further research may benefit from assessing the application of professional knowledge to retrospective reflection by designing reflection questions or prompts that mirror the design of the lab tasks. In addition, further research may consider transforming the lab into a standardized test. One potential starting point could be to replace the video clips of instruction of the observer tool with excerpts from lesson plans. Finally, further research may examine the use of the lab in a broader spectrum of preparation programs to further develop this tool and to provide further and more differentiated recommendations for practice. Furthermore, the majority of the participants showed few to no connections with professional knowledge in their lesson plans. This result was unexpected because the participants had received opportunities during their preparation program to connect professional knowledge with their lesson plans. This result suggests that it is challenging to connect professional knowledge with lesson planning. As such, preparation programs need to target the development of this ability. This finding is consistent with previous research showing preservice teachers' difficulty applying professional knowledge to their own practice. It expands previous research by focusing on the under-researched field of lesson planning. Further research is needed to determine what makes it difficult to develop predictions and justifications. What resources other than professional knowledge are used by preservice teachers in planning lessons? What aspects of preparation may support the development of lesson planning skills? And given the large differences among the participants' profiles, which students' characteristics, such as interest in teaching and learning, may play a moderating role in the development of lesson planning skills? Finally, comparisons between preservice teachers' lesson plans and observations of teaching revealed notable differences regarding the ability to use professional knowledge. For example, some participants showed few connections with professional knowledge in their lesson plans. In contrast, they displayed moderate to very high abilities to use professional knowledge in observation. Other participants made no connections with professional knowledge in their lesson plans. In contrast, they demonstrated moderately low to high abilities to use professional knowledge in their observations. Overall, most participants were less successful at planning than at observing. This might be due to coursework emphasis. Another possible reason, based on Blomek's model, is that additional abilities mediate the use of professional knowledge in lesson planning. These results suggest that we are talking about different abilities. Therefore, teacher-educators need to support each ability in specific ways. This finding expands previous research on professional vision by showing that acquiring the ability to reason about observations of teaching does not ensure the ability to reason about lesson plans. Qualitative research is needed to gain a better understanding of the relationships between planning and observation, and how they can be combined in teacher education. Research studies might ask preservice teachers to apply the same principles across observation and planning situations. If further research demonstrates that observation further research demonstrates that reasoning about lesson plans requires additional abilities, then a possible approach to gradually connect theory with practice in preparation programs might involve applying theories to observations of teaching before these theories are applied to lesson planning. The findings of this dissertation have limitations. I'm going to mention two of them. The proposed tool and approach are grounded in empirical research on lesson planning to a limited extent. Therefore, empirical research is needed to inform the further development of the proposed lesson planning pedagogy. In addition, the generalizability of the empirical findings is limited. Participants in this study were a cohort of preservice teachers in a program with a strong focus on integrating theory with practice. If the findings are replicated, we can expect participants' observation and planning skills to reflect their own coursework emphases. In conclusion, this dissertation contributed to the under-researched field of lesson planning and may serve to promote this topic in teacher education research. It used the more advanced research in other areas of teacher education to develop a lesson planning pedagogy. It has great practical relevance because it provided a tool for the implementation of the pedagogy and recommendations for practice. It carved a unique place in the research literature on professional vision. And finally, it advanced research on curriculum development that aims at integrating theory and practice in initial teacher education. That's all. Thank you very much for your attention.